Tokyo moved through a muted stillness in late July of 1941, as if the city itself sensed a shift beneath the surface of ordinary noise. Long before the first factory whistle sounded, a confidential telegram from Washington crossed the Pacific and landed on the desks of Japan's senior officers. It carried no fire, no explosion, no plume of smoke over a distant harbor. It was simply a declaration that every Japanese asset in the United States was now frozen. For a nation that drew 88% of its oil from American suppliers, it was the soundless beginning of a crisis that could reshape its fate. At the Naval Ministry, the corridors filled with hurried footsteps. Officers who had spent their careers calculating fleet maneuvers and air routes suddenly found themselves confronting a different kind of battlefield. Warships, aircraft, steelworks, merchant fleets, transport columns all depended on a constant flow of fuel measured in millions of barrels each month. The Empire's military strength was not forged from iron alone, but from the invisible river of energy that kept that iron moving. Without it, even the most formidable armadas would become monuments standing still on the water. Reports from California's ports arrived throughout the morning. Some tankers had not departed as scheduled. Others had been asked to halt processing of invoices until further notice. In Tokyo's ministries, the atmosphere tightened as men leafed through ledgers showing how completely their economy and their forces relied on American oil. 18 months of reserves had once seemed a margin wide enough to buy time. Now it looked more like a countdown. Outside, the city continued its routine. Streetcars rattled along the rails. Workers in heavy boots filed into shipyards. But beneath that ordinariness, something fundamental had shifted. A distant government had reached across an ocean and closed its hand around Japan's lifeline without firing a shot. A single administrative order was already beginning to influence the rhythm of an entire empire. In the quiet of a conference room, one officer asked whether a signature on a document could truly paralyze a nation prepared for war. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. It was as if Tokyo had glimpsed, for the first time, that power in the modern world did not always require cannon or steel. Sometimes it required only the ability to decide who received energy and who watched their supplies evaporate. The morning ended with more uncertainty than answers. Yet one truth had become impossible to ignore. A nation defined by its military might could still be cornered by the stroke of a pen. In the days before the freeze, Japan's senior officers had dismissed every warning from diplomats and economists who sensed a shift in Washington's posture. They believed the United States would never jeopardize its own commercial interests, especially when Japan had purchased more than 3 million tons of American oil in the previous year. They argued that a nation selling crude for barely $1 a barrel would not willingly abandon such a profitable relationship. This assumption hardened into doctrine, reinforcing a sense of strategic security that would soon prove fragile. Within Tokyo's ministries, the prevailing belief was that American caution would outweigh confrontation. Advisors insisted that economic interdependence formed a natural barrier against escalation. They pointed to years of steady trade and to shipping records that showed uninterrupted deliveries across the Pacific. Newspapers echoed this sentiment, suggesting that Washington's displeasure would manifest only in rhetoric rather than decisive action. The public accepted this narrative because it aligned with a familiar pattern. When tensions rose, commerce continued. Behind closed doors, a few voices urged reconsideration. They noted that Japan's expansion in Southeast Asia had begun to unsettle financial markets and that foreign banks were increasingly wary of handling Japanese transactions. Yet these warnings were drowned out by a more dominant mood of confidence. Many officers believed that great powers relied on oil as much as Japan did, and that the United States would therefore avoid any action that risked destabilizing global supply routes. They imagined a world where energy interests restrained political impulses. This mindset carried a quiet arrogance. It assumed that Washington needed the trade more than Tokyo needed the fuel. It imagined that a nation with vast industrial reserves would hesitate to use them as leverage. It trusted that the international system was too entangled for any one actor to pull a decisive thread. Such confidence reduced the possibility of a disruptive policy to little more than an academic hypothetical. The illusion began to fracture when banks in the Western Hemisphere started delaying Japanese payments. Though still subtle, these hesitations signaled that the financial ground was shifting. It was no longer a matter of diplomatic friction, but but of structural vulnerability. Tokyo did not yet understand that its economic lifeline was exposed and that a single decision abroad could transform certainty into crisis. That realization had not fully arrived, but the first cracks had appeared, and through them crept the possibility that everything Japan believed about its security might be wrong. The freeze order did not emerge from sudden anger or improvisation. It was the result of a long chain of developments stretching back more than a year, a chain that linked military expansion, diplomatic tension, and the quiet evolution of American financial power. When Japan increased its troop presence in French Indochina from 30,000 to more than 120,000 men, it sent a signal far louder than any communique. It marked a strategic ambition that threatened supply routes running through the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and it forced policymakers in Washington to reconsider the tools they were willing to use. In the months following that escalation, reports from American observers described not only the movement of soldiers, but the redirection of entire shipping networks. Tankers, cargo vessels, and troop transports converged toward ports newly under Japanese influence. Each change on the map carried an economic implication, and each implication pressed the United States to act before the balance of power shifted irreversibly. Washington understood that traditional diplomacy was growing less effective as Japan fortified its footholds across Asia. At the same time, the United States had been building an invisible architecture of control. In April of 1940, the Treasury created Foreign Funds Control, an institution tasked with monitoring and regulating foreign assets. Over the next year, it quietly established authority over more than $5 billion in outside holdings. This vast jurisdiction allowed Washington to interfere with financial movements that might support aggression abroad. It was a new kind of leverage, one that did not rely on fleets or divisions, but on the ability to interrupt the flow of capital. The combination of these developments pushed American policymakers toward a decisive shift. They recognized that Japan's access to resources allowed it to expand its military footprint at a pace traditional diplomacy could not match. If the United States wished to influence events in Asia without entering the battlefield, it needed a means of intervention that operated beyond the reach of armies. Financial power offered such a path, precise yet transformative. Thus emerged the logic behind the freeze. Rather than confront Japan directly at sea or in the air, Washington would target the foundation of its expansion, its capacity to pay for movement, fuel, and ambition. The decision stood at the intersection of strategy and restraint. It aimed not to provoke war, but to prevent one shaped by unfavorable conditions. It was an attempt to bend events before violence dictated their direction. By the time the order was drafted, the United States had already accepted a new reality. In a world where armies traveled on oil and industry thrived on credit, controlling money could reshape the map as surely as controlling territory. Once the freeze took effect, Japan entered a new phase defined not by battlefield maneuvers, but by a frantic search for fuel. The empire's reserves, previously assessed as sufficient for roughly 18 months, suddenly looked like a narrowing corridor with no exit. Planners who had once spoken confidently about long-term strategy now found themselves calculating time in weeks and days. Each revised estimate carried a sharper edge, exposing the fragility beneath the empire's outward confidence. Japanese ministries moved quickly to explore alternatives. Delegations attempted to redirect transactions through banks in Europe, hoping that distance might shield them from American influence. But European institutions, already strained by war and wary of being cut off from the Western Hemisphere, hesitated. Some postponed transfers, others refused outright. The caution spreading through financial centers was not ideological, it was practical. No bank wanted to risk being added to an expanding blacklist that could sever its own lifelines. Officials then turned towards Southeast Asia, seeking suppliers who might overlook the tightening web around Japanese commerce. Negotiators approached companies with access to Dutch and British oil assets, imagining that regional proximity might offer more flexibility. Yet these hopes dissolved quickly. Few producers were willing to sell significant quantities, and those who considered it demanded assurances that Japan could pay without attracting American scrutiny. With dollar transactions under strict control, Japan's purchasing power shrank regardless of how much it wished to buy. Meanwhile, the military faced its own reality. Fuel depots reported shrinking stocks. Training flights were reduced. Naval exercises were curtailed to conserve every barrel. Though operations continued, each decision carried an unspoken question about what would still be possible 6 months later. Commanders understood that modern warfare required not only bravery, but a steady stream of energy, and that every postponed shipment eroded the foundation beneath their plans. The strain was not limited to the armed forces. Industrial leaders warned that shortages would soon disrupt steel production, chemical processing, and transportation. Factories that relied on consistent deliveries began preparing for forced reductions. The economy that once powered expansion now revealed its dependency with stark clarity. Amid this tightening landscape, occasional hints of opportunity appeared. A shipment from Indochina arrived, raising brief hopes that regional supplies could offer relief. But the volume was small, a reminder that proximity could not compensate for global constraints. Each momentary success only highlighted the scale of the challenge. Japan's efforts to secure oil were persistent, creative, and driven by urgency. Yet every path eventually led back to the same truth. A nation could not escape a financial barrier enforced by an ocean-spanning network. The freeze had shifted the terrain, and Tokyo was now navigating a world in which its traditional sources of strength no longer guaranteed access to what it needed most. The turning point arrived on the 26th of July, 1941, when the United States announced that every Japanese asset under its jurisdiction was frozen without exception. The announcement was brief, almost austere, yet its implications reverberated far beyond the walls of the Treasury. For Japan, which depended on external fuel to sustain its military and industrial momentum, the freeze acted like a gate slammed shut with no warning. More than $500 million in Japanese holdings became inaccessible in a single moment. And with that disappearance came the collapse of a financial structure that had taken decades to build. The first effects unfolded not in battlefields, but in offices. Companies that had relied on dollar-denominated contracts found themselves unable to settle invoices. Accounts that had once supported regular imports were suddenly inert, their balances frozen behind regulatory walls. Without access to these funds, long-standing agreements became meaningless. Japanese firms tried to renegotiate, offering alternative currencies or deferred payments, but buyers and sellers alike understood the deeper shift. The dollar was not merely a medium of exchange, it had become a tool of enforcement. Beyond the world of contracts, the shipping lanes reflected the change with stark immediacy. Tankers en route to Japan were ordered to halt or turn back. Port authorities informed captains that clearance depended on financial confirmation that no Japanese entity was involved. With no such confirmation possible, vessels that had once traveled predictable routes now drifted in uncertainty. Each stalled voyage symbolized a loss measured not only in barrels, but in time, and time was the one resource Japan could no longer afford to waste. In Tokyo, the magnitude of the freeze began to settle in. Planners recognized that the disruption went deeper than the loss of funds. It touched the very architecture of Japan's global reach. Without access to the currency that governed international energy transactions, the empire's ability to fuel its ambitions diminished regardless of its military strength. The freeze was not merely punitive, it was systemic, cutting through layers of economic and logistical dependence that had been assumed immovable. Markets across the Western Hemisphere reacted quickly. Institutions that had previously considered doing business with Japan now backed away, unwilling to risk their access to American financial systems. Even companies with no political stance began enforcing their own restrictions, driven by fear of being swept into a widening circle of scrutiny. The freeze rippled outward, turning the world's financial map into a constellation of closed doors. As the reality crystallized, a new understanding took hold within Japan's leadership. The empire's vulnerability did not stem from a lack of courage or industrial discipline, but from a structural reliance on flows of energy controlled far beyond its borders. The freeze had revealed that reliance with unambiguous clarity. A nation that had imagined itself insulated by distance discovered that modern power could travel farther than armies, reaching across oceans to reshape the future without a single detonation. In Washington, the freeze was not viewed as an isolated measure. It represented a broader transformation in how the United States understood the mechanics of modern conflict. For generations, nations had assumed that military power rested primarily on fleets, armies, and the physical occupation of territory. Yet by 1941, American policymakers recognized a deeper truth. Warfare had become inseparable from the management of energy, credit, and supply. To influence the course of events without entering open combat, the United States needed to think in terms of systems rather than skirmishes. This shift emerged from a sober reading of global realities. The United States produced a dominant share of the world's oil and held financial reserves that dwarfed those of other industrial powers. Its domestic fields could generate more than 1 billion barrels in annual capacity, and its refineries operated on a scale unmatched anywhere else. With such resources at hand, the Treasury and the administration concluded that controlling access to these reserves was not simply an economic advantage, but a strategic instrument. Restricting or releasing energy became a way to shape geopolitical outcomes. By reframing energy as leverage, Washington adopted a mindset that fused economics and security. Control of capital flows, management of foreign assets, and oversight of international payments formed a new arsenal. These tools allowed the United States to exert pressure with precision, affecting nations that depended on external fuel and financing. Instead of responding to aggression with immediate force, policymakers could influence the choices of rival states by determining what they could buy, where they could sell, and how long their reserves would last. For Japan, this shift was disorienting because it challenged assumptions that had guided its expansion. The empire believed that naval superiority and territorial gains could secure its future. It assumed that industrial discipline and strategic positioning would provide insulation from outside intervention. What it had not anticipated was a rival capable of altering the rules of engagement by redefining power itself. Japan's planners had prepared for blockades and embargoes, but not for an economic worldview in which access to the global financial system determined the limits of ambition. This new American mindset introduced a paradox into the conflict. The nation with the largest industrial base did not need to send its might across the ocean to affect the Pacific balance. It only needed to decide when and how others could access the lifeblood of modern warfare. Through this lens, the freeze became more than a response to Japanese movements. It was a declaration that the architecture of global power had changed, and that influence in the 20th century could be exercised without a single ship crossing the horizon. As the freeze rippled outward, the United States began coordinating a broader effort across the Western Hemisphere. What emerged was not a traditional coalition formed through military alliances, but a network of financial restrictions that spanned more than 20 nations. From Canada in the north to Argentina in the south, governments aligned their policies with Washington's new approach, not out of ideological commitment, but out of recognition that access to American markets and banking systems was indispensable to their own stability. This alignment created a continental barrier through which Japan could not pass. The consequences were immediate. Japanese companies that had once relied on trade with Latin American suppliers suddenly found contracts suspended. Banks throughout the hemisphere demanded assurances that any transaction involving Japanese entities would not violate emerging restrictions. Without the ability to provide such guarantees, Japanese firms were quietly removed from commercial exchanges. What had been a complex web of relationships was now unraveling, replaced by a growing reluctance to engage with a nation under tightening scrutiny. Trade statistics captured the speed of this transformation. Within 6 weeks, Japan's commercial activity in the Americas had fallen by more than 90%. Shipments once routed through Caribbean ports or South American exporters were canceled or reallocated. Even industries with long-standing ties to Japanese buyers recalibrated their strategies, knowing that continued association could jeopardize their access to American credit. The decline was not merely quantitative. It signaled Japan's diminishing capacity to function as a global economic actor. For Japan's merchants and diplomats, the hemisphere's coordinated withdrawal felt like an unexpected encirclement. They had anticipated friction with the United States, but not a synchronized reaction from nations with whom they had maintained stable relations. The shift revealed the extent to which American financial influence shaped decisions far beyond its borders. It also demonstrated that power could be collective even without formal treaties, carried not by battleships, but by ledgers and regulations. The effects extended into the strategic realm, With each closed port and canceled transaction, Japan's ability to maneuver economically contracted. Energy access, industrial inputs, and logistical options shrank in parallel. The empire's outward-facing posture, once supported by global connectivity, began to collapse inward. Decisions that previously involved diplomatic negotiation now revolved around basic survival. The hemisphere's response confirmed an emerging reality. Influence in the modern world flowed through channels of finance as decisively as through channels of force. By persuading an entire continent to restrict its dealings with Japan, the United States demonstrated that its reach extended far beyond its own coastline. It could alter the contours of a distant power's future simply by shaping the environment in which that power tried to operate. As the pressure mounted, Japan confronted the harsh arithmetic of its ambitions. The empire's plans for expansion had always depended on a steady stream of foreign oil, roughly 30 million barrels each year, to sustain its military commitments and industrial needs. For a time, this reliance remained hidden beneath victories abroad and confident declarations at home. But when the freeze severed Japan from the global financial system, the numbers that once supported ambition became symbols of vulnerability. Factories were the first to feel the strain. Steel mills, chemical plants, and transport networks relied on reliable fuels to function at full capacity. As supplies tightened, industrial managers issued notices of reduced shifts. Some facilities began rationing power, dividing operations into rotating schedules to preserve what fuel remained. Conveyor belts that once moved continuously now paused for hours at a time. In the glow of dimmed lamps, workers sensed that the machinery around them was slowing not from mechanical failure, but from the exhaustion of a resource the empire could no longer replace. In the military sphere, the consequences grew more severe. Training programs were curtailed, not because of a lack of recruits, but because flight hours and naval exercises consumed too much precious fuel. Commanders who once charted bold strategies now weighed each operation against the dwindling reserves recorded in their ledgers. Calculations turned stark. Aircraft squadrons could not be replenished if fuel was spent too quickly, and ships sent on extended patrols might not receive the oil needed to return. Within government circles, debates intensified. Some argued for diplomatic concessions aimed at restoring limited trade. Others insisted that only force could secure the resources needed for survival. The discussion revealed an uncomfortable truth. Beneath the rhetoric of self-reliance, Japan remained bound to an international system it could not control. The empire had pursued territorial expansion to guarantee access to raw materials, yet its dependence on foreign oil showed that conquest alone could not solve structural deficiencies. The public, too, felt the shift. Households began to conserve kerosene as shortages loomed. Newspapers carried cautious reminders about fuel discipline, framed as patriotic responsibility. Life continued, but with an undercurrent of unease, as if the country were gradually dimming while trying to pretend the lights were still bright. In this climate, the freeze gained a deeper meaning. It was not merely an economic barrier. It was a mirror held up to a nation that had built its strength on foundations it did not own. The cost of the empire was no longer measured in battlefields, but in the silent erosion of the energy that sustained everyday life. When the immediate shock faded, the deeper consequences of the freeze began to reveal themselves. It had not simply interrupted Japan's access to oil. It had demonstrated that financial infrastructure could steer the fate of nations as powerfully as armies. This realization shaped the architecture of the post-war world. As the conflict progressed and ultimately concluded, policymakers across continents studied how one administrative decision had constrained an empire without a single ship leaving an American harbor. The lesson was unmistakable. Control of global finance could shape international order. In 1944, representatives from dozens of nations gathered to design a system that would prevent the economic instability that had contributed to conflict. The framework that emerged placed the United States at the center of monetary coordination. In the years that followed, transactions across borders increasingly passed through institutions aligned with American financial norms. The dollar became the reference point for more than 70% of international trade, not because it was imposed by force, but because the world had witnessed how swiftly it could restructure access to resources. This transformation influenced not only allies but former adversaries. Economists in Europe and Asia examined the freeze as a case study in the strategic use of currency. Some saw it as a warning about the dangers of dependence. Others viewed it as evidence of a new kind of influence that could stabilize or unsettle regions without the devastation of open warfare. Governments began building institutions to monitor external assets, manage capital flows, and guard against vulnerabilities similar to those that had exposed Japan. The financial state became a central figure in national security. The legacy also endured within the United States. The mechanisms first developed to oversee foreign assets evolved into a permanent system of oversight, eventually formalized in structures capable of administering hundreds of programs. These programs did not rely on military force, yet they carried implications just as significant. By regulating who could move money, access credit, or conduct trade, they became instruments through which the United States shaped behavior far beyond its borders. For historians, the freeze stands as a turning point, not because of the hardship it inflicted, but because of the world it helped create. It signaled that economic decisions were no longer background considerations, but pivotal forces that could alter geopolitical trajectories. The map of influence that emerged after the war was shaped not only by treaties and alliances, but by a recognition that financial power could extend across oceans and decades. In that sense, the freeze's legacy reached far beyond its original target. It helped define a century in which the flow of money became as consequential as the movement of armies, and in which the command over currencies and credit reshaped the balance of power in ways nations had only begun to understand. As the months unfolded, Japan returned again and again to the moment the freeze was announced, trying to understand how an empire built on military precision had been cornered by a decision made half a world away. In the final accounting, the shock did not come from the complexity of the policy, but from its simplicity. Everything traced back to a single figure that had once seemed routine: 88%. That was the share of Japan's oil drawn from suppliers whose transactions relied on the currency now locked beyond reach. A statistic that had once blended into trade reports became the measure of a nation's vulnerability. In Tokyo's offices, the number took on a symbolic weight. It appeared in internal memoranda, strategic estimates, and the private notes of officials wrestling with the realization that their country's future could be read in the fraction of a pie chart. The Army and Navy had long believed that discipline, planning, and force would determine the empire's direction. Yet the freeze revealed a harsher truth. Power rested on the ability to maintain the flow of energy that sustained both industry and ambition. Without that flow, even the most carefully constructed strategies unraveled. The reserves that had once promised 18 months of security now felt like a narrowing horizon. Each passing week reminded leaders that time itself had become an adversary. They adjusted schedules, postponed operations, and debated responses, but the underlying constraint remained unchanged. A nation could prepare for blockades, counterintelligence, or diplomatic pressure. It could not easily prepare for a world in which its access to essential resources evaporated without a shot fired. As the implications settled, a quieter understanding emerged. Japan's predicament was not simply the result of its own decisions, nor was it solely the consequence of American action. It was the product of a global landscape in which interconnected systems determined the limits of sovereignty. The empire had expanded to secure resources, yet expansion had never altered the fundamental dependency embedded in its economy. The freeze exposed that dependency in stark relief. By the end of the reflection, one lesson stood above all others. Modern power did not always announce itself with the roar of engines or the thunder of artillery. Sometimes it moved silently through the channels of finance, determining who would have the means to act and who would face the slow tightening of constraints. In that silence, Japan discovered that an empire could be halted not by force of arms, but by the quiet authority of a signature. If you are still here, tell us which financial story you want us to decode next. Thank you.